So thanks for having me today. So the presentation today is going to look at exploring news media in post-conflict or conflict settings, and to introduce some of my research from Northern Ireland to kind of flesh out some of the frameworks and theories that are there in the field. So, I'm trying to move on and I'm not sure whether sorry, it's not moving for me just like this for some reason. There we go. Okay, so the agenda today is just to give an overview of some of the main frameworks, theories and key research in the area of media, peace and conflict, to look at the Northern Ireland case study, and then to have some discussion after that. So basically, the literature really, and what we can all obviously see in our everyday lives, is that journalism serves as a particularly important voice in the production of public discourse. So in conflict-prone environments, the consequences of, for example, inflammatory words or deeds can be magnified through media coverage. And so the media's reporting, the nature of that reporting on different actors and events in peace and reconciliation obviously matters a great deal. So traditional, and that's very much within the kind of Western tradition, the values of journalism include objectivity, so reporting facts, impartiality, public service, autonomy, and a critical questioning of power. They would be the sort of foundational building blocks of journalism, I suppose. So those values underpin the argument that a free media is a vital part of a functioning democracy. So looking then at the application within peace and conflict studies, well, there's a lot of research to sort of suggest that the quality of media coverage can actually influence the development of post-conflict relationships and help shape the political system. And so what we see, a lot of research, something that Miho's already mentioned at the start around, for example, agenda setting, framing, priming, all these kinds of media effects, if you like. The media tends to focus more on conflict frames that simplify the complexities of a post-conflict society. And so this means that, for example, simplistic representations of past grievances, of issues, of decisions, of the actors themselves involved in peace and conflict can undermine peace efforts. And so, again, very topical at the moment, we've also seen, for example, misinformation or unduly critical representations of political actors' activity or settlements to have a tangible effect on the appetite for peace or conflict. So Gary Wilsfeld is a sort of seminal scholar in this field, and Wilsfeld has talked very much about the relationship between politics and the media and how that impacts on reporting of peace and conflict. And so Wilsfeld was one of the I guess, the contemporary scholars that has really looked at why it is that conflict tends to get more space within news reporting over, for example, peace and reconciliation. And Wilsfeld drilled down to say that, on the whole, news of peace or positive political progress is not considered newsworthy by journalists, because journalists, by the way they're trained, particularly in the Western tradition, is to value immediacy, drama, simplicity and ethnocentrism, all of which, you know, sort of contrast quite starkly to the realities of peace and conflict. So the unintended consequence of this is that journalists may themselves as individuals value peace, and of course journalists are also a product of their own socialisation and their environment, but that in their reporting they tend to devote more space to political conflict than peace. So with this notion in mind, building on framing research, Galtung has been one of the scholars, obviously written about peace in various ways, but peace journalism has certainly been a big part of that, where it critiqued war journalism for being propagandist, from being biased and partisan, and proposed that peace journalism was a way of trying to, I guess, improve reporting of peace and conflict. And that actually, if you were to implement the peace journalism framework, this is about embedding discussions about the roots of conflict, focusing on the experiences of everyday citizens rather than just elites, for example, or two warring parties. And so news stories from this perspective can be seen as intending on building empathy and understanding, and at the most sort of interventionist point, if you like, of the spectrum to even pose solutions to conflict. And we can talk a little bit about that later, I guess, in terms of what kind of ethical complexities come in there. So Jake Lynch and Annabelle McGoldrick operationalised Galtang's peace journalism framework and suggested that in practice then, this meant that journalists should write stories that focus on solutions rather than differences. And to do this, they feature ordinary people instead of solely elites, that they should report on more than just two sides of the conflict, if you like, and that reporters should be very precise and sensitive in their language in terms of how they describe events and issues around peace and conflict. So Ross Howard was another scholar that similarly talked about not peace journalism, but conflict-sensitive journalism. And so there's many similarities, but it does, again, prioritise this kind of engagement with people from across conflicting parties, and that really news reporting should involve conflict analysis. So that kind of analysis means that journalists should be examining what parties are seeking and the possibility for withdrawal, compromise or transcendence. So again, looking at issues of conflict as having a resolution and a positive one of that. With conflict analysis, journalists can understand what, for example, diplomats and negotiators are trying to do and report it reliably. And Howard really talked about how the conflict-sensitive journalism model doesn't have to violate the normative rules and values of journalists. So, for example, notions of objectivity or public service, but they can actually serve public interest by providing reliable information and working to keep government accountable. So constructive journalism then is what McIntyre and Sobel have talked about as kind of summing up the different frameworks that are there within the spectrum of journalism research. So peace journalism that we've just discussed, solutions journalism, which looks at how people respond to problems, and restorative narrative journalism that looks at kind of really bringing to the forefront these long-term stories of recovery and resilience, that all of these notions are part of what can be called the constructive journalism paradigm. And this builds on theories from quite a while ago now, but that even talk about the social responsibility theory of the press. So really this idea that the media should be concerned with the public good. And again, you know, you can see these types of terms in terms of social responsibility, the public good. All of this raises issues in terms of what is the public good? Are there different notions of that? And how is that borne out in the complexity of reporting of news and conflict and peace? So the thing, I guess, in terms of theories and what we're always trying to do as academics is to see whether these theories actually apply in real life practice. And so McIntyre and Sobel, for example, did a fairly recent study with journalists in Rwanda and looked at the fact of the history and the legacy of the conflict in Rwanda and the role of the media there, that journalists did describe their roles using these kind of traditional Western standards of objectivity, but they also felt a duty to promote unity and reconciliation via their reporting. Similarly, in some of my own work, and that, for example, by Armudian, I've looked at how journalists in Northern Ireland also talk about this kind of dual role. So Armudian study, for example, looked at how some journalists in Northern Ireland felt their professionalism was constrained in the wake of the peace process, both by sort of peace frames, if you like, but also by their own desire for peace, for being a citizen within their place of reporting. So within all this, I think it's important, of course, to come back to the political nature of peace and conflict and of news reporting itself. So Wilsfeld has talked about this in various ways. For example, he's talked about the political contest model, what he's called it, in terms of media and politics kind of being in a contest with each other to set the agenda or to tell stories that sort of are within their own interests. So Wilsfeld says that really there's 5 principles that need to be considered when examining the interrelationship of media and politics. One is that political power can be usually translated into power over the news media. 2, that when authorities lose control over the political environment, they also often lose control over the news. 3, that there's no such thing as objective journalism, nor can there be. 4, that the media are dedicated more than anything else to telling good stories. And 5, that the most important effects of the news media on citizens tend to be unintentional and unnoticed. And Wilsfeld will say that that's when they're actually most influential over people's framing of issues around, for example, peace and conflict. So Wilsfeld very much talks about how if you want to understand the role of the media in politics, in peace and conflict by extension, you have to look at the political context, reminding us that every journalist constructs news stories that are firmly rooted in a particular time, place, culture and set of political circumstances. And that more often than not, journalists almost always react to political events rather than initiate them. So something to bear in mind, I guess, when we go through and look at the case study of Northern Ireland, and indeed to think about the role of media elsewhere. So the case study I'm going to present today then is around Northern Ireland, where I'm from and where I live today. Northern Ireland is an interesting context. I think I've just placed the map there, but it's obviously one part of the United Kingdom on the island of Ireland. And so a lot of media research that looks at local journalism in conflict zones has tended to look at, for example, developing nations with weak or new media systems, or to sort of have the views of international war correspondents that might drop in, if you like, into a war zone. And so Northern Ireland presents quite an interesting case because it's obviously highly developed. It has a highly economically developed free society, but it is still emerging from a period of very violent conflict throughout the 1970s onwards. So it's a theoretically interesting case study, I think, of a free media sector working in a post-conflict context. So anyone that knows anything about Northern Ireland, or indeed you guys will be used to having to try and give some context for what are very complex matters in terms of peace and conflict. But I just wanted to give a flavour here of Northern Ireland in the sense that there was a period of around 30 years plus conflict that led to, you'll see the stats there, over 40,000 people injured, 3,500 people killed. And obviously there's the legacies of that still go on today in terms of paramilitary violence, the ongoing division in society. But from 1998, we've had the Good Friday Peace Agreement, which led to the implementation of a devolved from Westminster in its own right, consociational power sharing government. So where we have mandatory power sharing between unionist and nationalist political parties. So that's representing what would be seen as, in very sort of simplistic terms, representing the unionist and Protestant community and the nationalist and Catholic community. So at the moment, and for most of the last decade or so, we've had 5 main political parties really in Northern Ireland, that being the DUP, a Democratic Unionist Party, Sinn Féin, which would be a Irish Republican Party, the SDLP, which would be an Irish Nationalist Party, and the Ulster Unionist Party, and also the Cross Community Alliance Party. So there's no official opposition, if you like, in the normal sort of, or the sense of how we would see it, for example, in the wider UK. But there is, as you would imagine, quite significant opposition within government in terms of managing all these party dynamics. So there's strong polarisation within government, where the 2 largest parties are from the 2 political extremes, if you like, that being the DUP and Sinn Féin. And that's led to various issues over the years. For example, from 2017 to 2020, we had a breakdown in relations in government, meaning that we actually had a collapse in the Assembly, where we were governed directly from Westminster during that time. There's also, I guess, quite interesting societal contradictions, if you like, that There's sort of a widespread appetite for a peaceful society in Northern Ireland, but voting still kind of tends to fall along these tribal lines. So voting for unionist parties to keep unionists as the largest party, or vice versa on the nationalist side. So Northern Ireland's promoted as a successful example of peace building, but it is still a deeply divided society. Still, most of our school children go to school in separate schools. So you would have sort of Catholic schools or state schools, and then we have some integrated schools. And the picture you'll see here is just one picture of a living peace wall between an actual physical barrier between two sides of the community in Belfast. So it's led this and the fact that we've still got sporadic terrorist activity and sectarian violence, paramilitary violence leads people to sort of say that we're neither sort of fully at war nor at peace. And there is this kind of oscillation between mild to extreme crisis within government. So thinking about the media then, in terms of our main mainstream media, if you like, broadcast would be BBC Northern Ireland. We have Ulster Television and several independent radio channels. So all of this local news would be sort of broadly targeted as cross-community. Our newspapers, in terms of at least the regional daily newspapers, are slightly different. So we would have the Belfast Telegraph, which is targeted as cross-community, so targeting both unionist and nationalist citizens. But we would have the Irish News that would be very much targeted towards the nationalist community, and you'll see certain kind of symbols on this front page that I'm showing you just now that would give you that the clues to that. For example, you've got the fact that Derry is talked about there rather than Londonderry. We've got Gaelic football that's very much part of the nationalist community at the top, and you've got the sort of headline there that is a slightly critical headline around loyalism, for example. We've got the newsletter, which would be targeted towards the unionist community. Again, there's certain cues there in the types of stories that are covered and the language that's used, for example, around dissidents and talking about the massacre, that, as it's called at the top. So some people then would still make the argument that this sort of helps to propagate division within society. It's what Hallen and Mancini would call political parallelism, where sort of these different kind of cultural and religious affiliations are reflected in news media in terms of how they frame issues and how they cater to different markets. So during the Troubles, as it's called, that's the term for the period of the most violent period of conflict in Northern Ireland, the media has been researched, and there's kind of different strands. So we've got the strand that looks at how the media tended to reflect the British government's agenda, and local journalists had sort of restricted access to government sources. So this meant that some local journalists would complain that they didn't get to fully play out their investigative journalist role because they're kind of starved of access to information from government. The media was later viewed as a kind of advocate for the development and maintenance of the peace process. And in more recent years, the media have then been discussed as really adopting more of a traditionally critical role, if not an oppositional role, which is how, for example, in some of my past research, the media have been viewed, particularly by the political class, as almost like a sort of political opposition. And you can imagine within the journalistic field that is a notion that's surprisingly some people sort of do support and see themselves in that way, and others are very much opposed to seeing themselves as any way that way inclined. So as I've discussed as well, the press could be seen as propagating division in the sense that there is this kind of split within the regional press that still exists. So some empirical research that I just wanted to touch on today comes from, I've decided to look at some more recent work that looked at relationships really between politics, the media, public trust and reconciliation. And so throughout 2016 and 2017, I conducted in-depth semi-structured interviews with cross-community group leaders on their views of government and media in present-day Northern Ireland. And so It's important, I guess, just to say that non-governmental organisations, cross-community or community organisations in general in Northern Ireland are a key part of civil society. We have a very vibrant non-profit sector. And so the rationale for speaking to these people are that these people are not only people that engage with the media on a daily basis through their professional work, but they also have this kind of, they span this link between government, civil society and the media. And so they have a very good inside view in terms of how the media works, how relationships work between government and media, and indeed how their own stakeholders view the media. And so they have these kind of competencies and experiences to critically critique the media's role. And so the question that I'm looking at today is really, how do non-profit leaders characterise the media's role in reconciliation in Northern Ireland? So I just want to touch on, I guess, some key kind of insights from the study. The first being around media sources. Interestingly, media sources were still broadly these kind of mainstream broadcast and press outlets. That's where they went to for their news. Of course, they also talked about, for example, national newspapers such as The Guardian and so on. On the whole, the media were not well trusted. So, for example, they talk about the BBC being considered still, for example, the most reliable, but not fully investigative or representative. Political blogs and Twitter were seen as certainly being very important routes to accessing news and becoming very much more part of the kind of daily activities of news gathering. But they were considered particularly to be these kind of echo chambers, so you tend to get reinforcement of your own kind of views. The Northern Ireland mainstream media were considered to cover news in a kind of soft or sensational way. So through, for example, attending to controversy and negativity for, as a lot of people have discussed in the study, around these kind of commercial pressures or purposes. And the media were considered to be very heavily influenced by government sources in their topic selection. So some key quotes then on these themes. So around media scepticism and distrust, that was very much talked about in terms of their views of the media. People tended to talk about how they had this scepticism, not only because of the kind of stands, if you like, that they take around things, but also the quality of some of the journalism. So, for example, where things are factually wrong, where there's kind of carelessness showed, or poor grammar, spelling, things like that all kind of accumulate to develop this kind of mistrust or distrust. Their primary interest is not, if you think back to some of those normative frameworks, is not seen as being to serve the public interest, but really to ensure they're successful. And linked to that then was this idea that really bad news sells papers, it sells news in general, and so they weren't considered to be a force for good. So media framing came into this. Of course, there's a lot of literature in this area in terms of the impact of media frames on peace and conflict. And so there were some really good examples of how the people we interviewed, the non-profit leaders, actually saw this play out in everyday life in Northern Ireland. So, for example, they gave instances of where around, for example, assembly elections could be framed as an old spat between unionism and nationalism, and that kind of really helped increase the anti-political mood. And that actually a lot of the positive things that are going on the ground, if you like, some community integration or the growth of minority or independent parties, independent politicians, was overlooked as it didn't fit these kind of very long-standing binary frames. The media was seen to stir things up and to try to look for more controversial or negative story angles to generate interest. And this where the title comes for this talk, is that really reconciliation wasn't seen as being sexy. It didn't have these dramatic news angles, these kind of easy frames of black and white that could be put within a story. It was complex. It was a lot of it was intangible, and these types of stories weren't seen as being a fit for news in Northern Ireland even today. And so the stories that tended to get talked about or promoted within the media, if you look at the example here around the kids and the bad weather. So one leader was talking about how their natural issue with the media is when, for example, young like teenagers or youth in the community were out, for example, scraping and salting during bad weather, doing cleanups around the area, and a photograph and a story was sent on to a journalist about this. This was not in any way seen as something that was newsworthy. However, if there was a sort of burnt out car or a particular incident of violence, there would be a drive for media attention from that. So within this kind of discussion of media negativity, there was a very strong theme of how the media were seen by community leaders really to have these kind of special responsibilities in a divided post-conflict society. So the media was seen as having sort of allowed the framing of this kind of sectarian slant, this us or them, this unionist nationalist narrative to be propagated and to allow politicians to keep sort of using this to frame issues. And the impact of that was that not only were politicians getting the space to kind of use that, whether that's in terms of because they wanted to get elected or they didn't want to talk about other things and deflect from other kind of issues, but it was squeezing out the space, if you like, to talk about what are seen as more important social issues of the day. So health issues, education issues, issues that really affect people on a daily basis. All of that was seen to sort of get sidelined. And so the media were seen as helping the political parties to drag society back and keep this kind of negative politicking going. So thinking about some of the frameworks that were introduced at the start, this is where we did see community leaders to actually sort of concur with that. They thought that in a context, a post-conflict context like Northern Ireland, that not only should the media just be there to sort of report on happenings, but they should go further. They should use their power for good rather than to keep conflict going, that there was a responsibility on the media to exercise some sort of additional ethical responsibility. And so to cover more than what's seen as these very sort of inward-looking and partisan issues, and to try and really develop deep conversations. For example, to have a responsibility of playing a role in creating a sense of place and within Northern Ireland and across community place at that. There were some kind of interesting comments on social media as well in terms of how there was the sort of very much the benefits and the drawbacks of this approach. So where you can see on social media, there's a variety of opinions and sources, and that variety and that sort of democratic and open nature was very much valued by community leaders. On the other hand, it was seen as sort of very much reflecting the theory of this echo chamber of removing people from the real source of information. So it can be a sort of way, a route into to finding news that's to your particular interest, but that you were always having to sort of think about how your news feed was being filtered, for example, and how this reinforcement of your own views might be happening. So having said all this, you can see obviously there's a fairly negative kind of view of the role of the media in reconciliation in Northern Ireland. Community leaders interestingly talked about their own work, their work of their colleagues and their stakeholders that they work with on a daily basis to try and build peace in Northern Ireland, that they were really filling this gap, if you like, that the media and both politics are not addressing. So for example, even business as well as a non-profit sector, we're seen as, if you like, having a policy instinct and a policy machine that the media doesn't have. That these groups, these cross-community groups in particular, were seen as being the places to facilitate these public conversations. So the place to really get to, flesh out some of these long-standing issues, to challenge deeply held beliefs, and to really, get into this grey area that is needed in terms of having reconciliation actually happen to the full extent that it can. So in many ways, they saw community trust as surpassing kind of trust in government and the media. So trust is really being built from the bottom up in that respect. And so in terms of government and the media, there was seen as being a lot of tired opinions, that a lot of the comment and news coverage was seen as being very predictable, and that fresh approaches and perspectives were required to challenge this kind of this negative status quo. So some conclusions then were just that community leaders did note this gap between the potential role for the media in a post-conflict society and the actual behaviour of the media in reporting on peace and conflict, and this peace transition that has been underway for many years now. So they considered the media in Northern Ireland to focus on conflict, and therefore to make these kind of societal and political divides salient, rather to engage in this kind of conflict-sensitive journalism that constructive journalism scholars would advocate. And so what we found was that in the end, interviewees were essentially advocating for this kind of conflict-sensitive journalism model, but it was underpinned by a kind of communitarianism and that kind of ethical framework that promotes the post-conflict common good. And so Clifford Christians has done some work on this in terms of communitarian ethics and applying that to the potential role that the media can play. So communitarianism really places the community rather than the individual at the centre of decision making. So it's been applied as a kind of normative media theory in itself. And it talks about, of course, what can be seen as, and I think a lot of we'd be able to appreciate in quite idealistic terms, but that coverage should be driven by community norms and not by markets or mechanical efficiency. So what this would mean then, essentially, I guess, in the likes of Northern Ireland would be that rather than journalists conveying the same two sides of political issues in Northern Ireland, that in this new post-conflict context, that people would like to see different dimensions of long-standing issues being highlighted to reflect these new norms, and the new generation, of course, that has come through in Northern Ireland that has thankfully been pretty much insulated from the worst experiences of violence in Northern Ireland. So I think it's important as well to say that communitarianism, although there are these kind of normative or idealistic kind of standards within it, it does take and hold difference seriously. So the public sphere is seen within this context as a mosaic, if you like, of particular communities, of a pluralism of ethnic identities and worldviews that intersect. So the ideal is that you can still sort of form a social bond, but you can still hold seriously and competitively these different aspects of society, and that the duty for the media then within that is really to reflect those differently held views. So the lessons, I guess, if we were to take something away in terms of thinking about this more generally, is that of course the media is a reflection of the particular environment that it reports on, and journalists are one actor within that. And so media roles, of course, need to evolve as communities themselves evolve away from conflict in order to reflect the interests of a kind of new society. And so I think a lot of what we actually saw in the study as well was that the role of these kind of community leaders and this on the ground kind of change that is seen to be leading that narrative, and that the media is seen as being able to kind of help push that narrative to the surface outside of these quite polarised long-standing divisions. So that was a quick kind of whistle-stop tour, I guess, in terms of what I was going to present today. I have some discussion points that I can raise, or perhaps I'll open it up to you guys to see if you have any questions first.